As we all, or many of us would know already, Barbados' 50th anniversary of independence is coming up. And the whole country, or at least the government, seems to be abuzz about, hey, we need to celebrate this. We had the launch, which was in January, but somehow some people thought it was supposed to be last year, November. Some people thought we were celebrating from November, but then they realized, or the government came out and said, well, the committee came out and said, it's going to be January, we starting off January, I think it was the 6th, and then some people are saying it should be on Earl Barrow Day, all these different things. I'm not really going to talk about that sort of thing, about the fine reason, if it should be this date or that date or whatever. Not saying these things aren't important, because sometimes the correct date sets us the right mood, and you don't want to celebrate too early, you don't want to celebrate too late, blah blah blah. But if there is something I'm going to speak about, it would have to be what it means to us to be not just independent, but what it means for us to have a culture. And over the years you would hear things such as, okay, well, Barbados does not have any culture, or we need to set out what our culture is, we need to define for ourselves what our culture is. Very true, at least for the second one, about needing to actually set out what your culture is. Now, in many respects, you're going to realize that there is a Barbadian culture, there's a West Indian culture, there's a Caribbean culture, and to some extent then there is a culture of the Americas. But we can argue, yeah, there is no set, defined culture that we can say is Barbadian at this point. But you can also argue against that. And I'm not really going into the arguments for or against sort of secondary schoolish sort of debates, argumentative essays or whatever, though those things are important. I'm going to say something that sounds a bit cheesy at times, but if you want to know what you're about, which is basically you want to know your culture, you want to know what you're about, but then one of the best ways to do that is to look within yourselves. At the end of the day, when you look at another country and you say, well, that's their culture, even if you just look at Jamaica, you say, well, that's their culture, you realize that these things are not just that they're indigenous because it is your culture, but these things tend to be spontaneous. Of course, the Barbadian mode of doing things is to plan, and that's good, but I don't really know how we're going to exactly plan our culture. We can plan certain aspects of our culture, we can plan how our economic models run, how we do things in the country to make which can have an impact on the spontaneity of the culture itself. But there comes a time when we have to realize that in order for us to actually make a culture, we have to do things as individuals, as families, as religious organizations, as all schools. All these different levels have to come and play in this whole mass, this whole Kadooment, carnival, whatever you want to call it. Mentioning those things. Culture is more than dancing and rum and things like that, by the way. But those things are very important. Culture has to embrace everything you hold yourself to be, because only when you hold yourself to be something can we as the people hold ourselves to be something. And then the culture itself would be the common denominators of all of the things that we hold ourselves to be. So at the end of the day, when you say, oh, that is this thing here is the Barbadian culture, what we're really saying is these are the things that we have seen over the years that show us that we are Barbadians. And in this 50th year of our anniversary of independence, I would venture to say, and I would challenge you to look beyond the 50 years, to look from the settlement of Barbados, look before the settlement of Barbados, look at the indigenous people, look at as much history as you can, and come all the way up to today. Come all the way up to today and say, hey, all of this is our history. And from all of this history, what do we find today that makes us us? What do we not find today, but somehow it still makes us us, but it's not absolutely present? Is it some sort of moral thing that was there, but we know that we still have it inside of us, but we don't practice it outright today? What are these things? If we can find these things, if we can mold ourselves into these things that we find dear to us, we can somehow produce a culture. there will come a day then that there will be no more. What is our culture? It would be, that is the Barbadian culture. Just like how you know that is the French culture, or that's the Jamaican culture, or that's the Spanish culture, or the English culture. We would know that's the Barbadian culture. And let us not grade ourselves too hard, even though grading yourself hard is a good thing. 50 years of independence is only, those things, 50 years are only 50 years. By the way, on that point, 50 years of independence do not mean that, oh, 50, that's all we have. No, we have many years, and you're not going to want, for many people are not going to want to embrace other parts of the history because of slavery. I know this. I've had many debates with my Pan-African friends about this. I've had various debates with them. I wouldn't say many. I've had discussions. Some people start to get very hot and heavy and what's not. But what I am saying is, we have to look at the entirety and say, hey, this determination, this self-determination was here before. Barbados was a self-ruling colony long before. The Charter of Barbados, the Battle of Jamestown, no taxation without representation, which is highly touted in America, but where did that come from? Let's look at these things. In the Constitution of Barbados, though it is at times seemingly a generic law passed by the Westminster Parliament, there is something at the beginning in the preamble about the Charter of Barbados. What is this thing? What was the symbolism behind the Battle of Jamestown? What is the stature of our Parliament in the world today? Why is it that we have so many years of a Parliament? Why is it that Barbados is recognized as a country that really does produce some of the best human beings out there? Not just in terms of the minds that are producing producing leadership at state level or geopolitical level, but in terms of those who are pushing forth in whatever they're doing, wherever they are in the world. Let's look at different schools. Let's look at every single school. Let's look at schools like Coleridge and Parry. Why is Coleridge and Parry named Coleridge and Parry? Who are the bishops of Barbados? Who are the namesakes of that school? Why is that school named that school? Why is Harrison's Cave named Harrison's Cave? Let's look at these things and let's find in our history common threads that we can look at and say, hey, that's us. Let's look at our sugarcane. Let's look at our rum. Let's look at our education model. Let's look at ourselves and our music. Let's look at the migration of Jackie Opal, where he went in the region, what he did. These are things that we can look at and say, hey, this is Barbados' contribution to itself and to the world, to the region. What can we say about Barbados today? What can we say about Barbados and what we're doing today to make sure that our legacy lives on? 50 years of independence. If you want to celebrate it, let's celebrate it right. Let's call into vogue all of the other hundreds of years that led up to independence, and let's call up into vogue and into focus 50 years. What do those mean to us? If we can figure out what those things mean to us, we're well on our way.